Steam ploughing engines were the first form of mechanization in farming. They were large and expensive outfits and mostly operated by contractors traveling from farm to farm. My first memories of the great engines arriving at my farm, the Grove, was the noise and the clatter and the whistles going on far into the night. The drivers signalled to each other across the fields. 1 toot for start, 2 for stop. One man sat on the plough to weight it down and to some extent to steer it, and the engine to pull the plough up and down the field on a cable over 200 yards long. One engine winding the cable in while the other released it. The plough itself was just like several horse ploughs fixed together, so it had the output of several teams of horses and never got tired. When I first started to farm in 1931, the countryside around must have been as beautiful as it had ever been. There are still a few isolated pockets looking much as they did then, all overgrown, with only a glimpse of the small fields through dense hedges. To the farmer, it was a picture of neglect. Land full of weeds, which are flowers to everybody else. This was a result of long years of agricultural depression, land untended, and even some farms abandoned. My family were very much against me going into farming, and I had to conduct quite a campaign to get the lease of the farm, which my father had bought in 1919, late 1918, because they didn't think it would be possible for anybody to make a living. Although the employment situation generally was difficult in 1932, they thought I would be better to try and get an office job or something of that sort. And in fact, I went through the motions of trying to get a job and failing fairly deliberately in order to persuade the trustees of my father's estate to give me a lease on this farm. I started with one advantage over some other people. Starting at the very bottom must necessarily be not too bad a place to start. Other people, well-known farming families in the area, were going bankrupt the year I started. From time to time, I record my recollection of those early days on tape, so that they shouldn't be forgotten. Now, not many people remember, and even fewer farm in the way they used to. One who does is my neighbour, Maurice Brown. Maurice still keeps some fallow. When I started farming, a quarter of the land in the Chilterns was in fallow as part of a very old rotation. Now that's all gone. Maurice is still in the house from which his father was farming when corn prices collapsed. Prices had been guaranteed in the First World War, and at short notice all guarantees were removed and the prices halved overnight. During the next 10 years, many farmers fell by the wayside. Some struggled and survived. One way of surviving was to do a whole lot of different things, and that's what most of us tried. Maurice is still doing that.
We've got 400 hens, laying birds, and we sell quite a lot of eggs at the door. The rest I take to market. We've got 100 ducks. There's not a great demand at the door for duck eggs, but there is at the market. Cattle, we've got 52 of all sorts and sizes. We've got 6 sows and a boar. At the moment we've got 4 litters. One's 13, 1 12 and 2 11.
Maurice, how much land have you got here?
158 acres.
So it's just about the same amount as I'd got when I started. And it seems to me, coming around here, that you're doing very much the same things as I was when I started. A little bit of a great number of different things. Do you remember, in those days, quite a number of farms in this area were totally derelict?
And the homesteads were desolate.
Yeah.
Through the government of that day bringing in cheap food from abroad.
Your family, I think it's worth mentioning, that really, I don't say survived, but did the farming pretty well during the Depressions because they were into pheasant breeding.
It was the pheasant breeding that kept them all going. I think there was 4 sons and a grandfather. They all had a separate farm each and combined to produce pheasants for sale to the landed gentry, I suppose you call them. and the big estates, and that kept everyone going. But when the wars came, of course, that all finished. And we had to grow food for the country until such time as the country said, right, we've had enough. You can go to the dogs. Which a lot of people did. Farms went desolate. The homesteads were in rack and ruin.
In the 1920s, Grove Farm, like many others in the Chilterns, went into milk production. In farming, you have to do what you can do, what conditions and the market allow. We had to find a substitute for our traditional grain growing. At Grove Farm, my father had recently laid on water to almost all the fields when he had sown them down to grass. So for the first time, livestock could be kept on a large scale. During this period, all the publicity was that milk was good for you. Providentially, there was a growing population in the area, and so an increased demand for milk. There's still one man in this area, Roy Glenister, milking on the same scale that we used to. Milking cows, which were lying out all the time, and they didn't live in a shed in the winter, they lay out in the mud, and calling in dirty cows at 5 o'clock in the morning, making some effort to wash them clean before you milk them, and then sitting under them and milking them with their filthy tails slapped around your face every few minutes. It's a dirty, nasty job, not a romantic job at all.
Come on. Come on. Come on. Come on. All right. Come on. Come on.
I started with 18 cows. I saw an advertisement which said, increase your herd by hire purchase. And I did. We were soon up to 30 cows. At that stage, we installed a milking machine. Now, this way of milking is exactly as we were doing it in 1934. Indeed, the shed is very much the same. A single line of cattle with a feeding passage in front and a gutter like this, almost exactly the same. The trouble was our shed fell in the moat and we had to make some alternative arrangements. Prior to the Milk Marketing Board, you had to find your own outlet for milk. I inherited a contract in Hemel Hempstead, which was going well until I was given 1 week's notice they wouldn't take my milk anymore. So I had to retail it myself, going round knocking on doors, trying to persuade people that my milk was better than anybody else's. I bottled it and had to go far afield for my customers, so I had a van. Most milk was delivered from a churn on a pony float. A lot had barrows. They had a little three-wheel barrow with a milk churn on it with a tap at the bottom, and people brought their jugs out and they sold the milk that way. And the older housewives preferred it that way. They imagined they got more than a pint for a pint. They didn't. Milk was threepence a pint, and many families couldn't even afford half a pint. And collecting the money was often a problem for the milkman. We did our best to keep the milk clean, filtering it through cotton wool. But a lot of dirt showed up, and heaven knows how much had been dissolved into the milk. There was a man in Chesham who advertised his hygienic milk, advertised his milk round for sale, so I went and saw him. He was a drinking man, and he had obviously got a terrible hangover, and he was sitting rather later than I would have been in the morning milking under this cow, all dirty. And when he opened his mouth to talk to me, his pipe dropped in the milk. And he leapt down, scooped it out with his dirty hand, dried it off, swore a bit and let up again before answering me. And I thought if his customers for his hygienic milk really knew what was happening, they wouldn't have cared for it. Compulsory pasteurization hadn't been brought in. Milk was sold raw, and it only kept a relatively short while. So the customers expected 2 deliveries a day, and if you didn't do it, somebody else would. It was terrific competition. Delivering milk by yourself, especially at weekends and Christmas and things like that, when everybody's in bed, it was a lonely, miserable business. And I had the habit of sort of singing as I went round delivering, it was popular songs of the time, but more likely hymns because they're easier to sing. And I think this got on the nerves of the local population slightly, as I had a very powerful voice. I remember receiving a note in Green Lane, Amersham once from somebody. It said, "Dear Milkman, I'm a deeply religious man, but the sound of the 23rd Psalm in a very loud voice and not too tunefully at 5:30 in the morning is too much for me." Although our main sale was milk, cattle themselves had to be bought and sold from time to time. They could be walked along the road to market because there was so little traffic about. I can remember driving a shorthorn cow called Ruth all the way from Ballinger, which is some 4 miles the other side of Chesham, all by myself without any trouble at all, except when I was going through the town, when all the children ran after her, throwing things and calling out. The first cows I bought when I first started on my own were in late 1932, and they were bought at farm sales in the area, one at a time. Not much planning about it. I just went to a sale, the first one in Amersham, and I bought one cow, bought from a man called Mr. Lofty, who was selling up. So the cow was known as Lofty for the rest of her life. The next cow I bought was from Flaundon, from a farm called Moonshine Farm, and she was known as Moonshine for the rest of her life. That's the way it went.
I go 60, 16 off, 1, 1 off.
Many small markets have disappeared, but Tring, which was our nearest market in the 30s, has kept going. It's still very local, catering for vendors from within about 15 miles.
75,
The cattle used to be of one breed, Shorthorns, bred to produce both milk and beef. In these days of specialisation, they have been replaced by specialist breeds for milk or beef. 50 years ago, I was sending animals to Tring, and we still send our smaller animals here. Animals go out on really big wagons. The cobblestones and narrow alleys of the market were not made for this kind of traffic. In the early days, most animals were walked to market, though some of the better ones would have been brought in on a horse-drawn float, so they didn't run off all their fat on the way. The limit of the market is the limit of transport. You can only produce what you can sell within reasonable reach. When horses were the main means of transport, all trade had to be within the range of a horse journey. Everything was still provided locally. Every village a blacksmith, every town an engineer, and Chesham had its own knacker. The health of cattle was very bad. More than 40% of the cattle in Britain had TB. More than 40% of them had contagious abortion. So the casualties were enormous. Added to which you've got regular casualties with them swallowing wire and things of that sort. And the knacker would come out at any time of the week, almost any time of the day and night, to remove your dead animal. And of course, by doing that, he gained an enormous experience in animal health and could give you often very good advice as to how to avoid further disasters. Now, our own knacker in Chesham, a man called Harry Wing, who kept a pub, built up a tremendous reputation, so everybody relied upon him for everything. He ran his business rather like a charity. What he paid you for the dead animal depended on three things. What it was worth, how easy it was to get it back home, and how much sympathy he had for you. And that was the biggest of the three factors. It was very notable that if you had a number of losses, the amount he gave you for each animal went up a bit as he got more sympathetic with you. But Harry Wing had the Golden Bull pub in Chesham with some stables behind it, and he carried on his knacker business there. And it was a bit of a gory mess, with dead animals hanging up in these stables right in the middle of the town, and he would sell off dog meat to the ordinary residents of Chesham. In the end, people relied on him so much they consulted him about family affairs. He told me one story of a farmer who brought his pregnant wife about to give birth in the back of a pony cart to him because he couldn't think of anything else to do with her. The only person he knew everything about everything was the knackers. Now, in the age of specialisation, all this local activity is gone. Some people prefer to keep going in the old ways. Maurice Brown can survive, but he owns his own farm, has very low overheads and lives very simply.
Why do I keep on with this mixed farming? Well, it's so interesting, for one thing, and you see such a variety of things going on. The animals, the poultry, and the growth of the corn, the growth of everything. It may not be economical, but there's satisfaction in it. Maybe it's old-fashioned, but everything becomes old-fashioned in time, doesn't it?
It all adds up to hard work. The farm labourer had to turn his hand to everything. Will Barnett, who worked for me for 50 years, although primarily a horseman, could make most machines work. This is the elevator on a farm museum nearby. Will hadn't seen one for a great many years, but he knew how to put it together.
That's got her.
Right, that's the easy bit. This sort of equipment had a very long life, probably 100 years, and similar machines in use all over Britain. Some use them either for stacking hay in the field or for lifting sieves up onto a corn rick. It will shift anything up and quite a distance as well. We had one absolutely identical to this, with the exception that ours was driven by a horse. The horse walked round and round all day, driving the machine.
Let me join hands.
When this machine was fully extended and at work, it was a pretty impressive sight. Right upright like that, 25 or 30 foot high, 2 men putting hay on at the bottom, 3 men having it dropped on them at the top, probably more quickly than they can always contend with, 3 of them attempting to build a rick out of it. Of course, you wouldn't have it like that until you were finishing the rick. You start off with it quite low and dropping it down on the men who were building the ricks. And then every hour or so, according to how fast you were progressing, somebody would get off and wind it up with that gear a little bit higher until eventually you were completely at the maximum height, those poles vertical. To see some of the machinery which was in normal use when I was young, we had to come to a steam fair in Dorset, where people were doing for fun what we used to do as hard and disagreeable labour. I went with John Boughton, whose family used to be agricultural contractors in the area, and who himself came to my farm with a thrashing machine. Steam engines for farm work came in the middle of the 19th century and lasted a long time, right up to the 50s of this century. And I remember them in their heyday in the 30s. When the thrashing machine came to the farm, it had a number of pieces of ancillary equipment. The chaff cutter to cut up oat straw for the horses, an elevator to put the straw onto a stack, and later a baler to make it into big, heavy, wire-tied bales.
Before the war, the conditions were such that we had the contractor supplied the driver and a feeder, a second man known as the feeder, and if we could get one, the third man, who came along as a sort of band cutter. But then we had to have a team of up to, another 10 people if we get them.
What we've seen today, John, is really too clean, too straightforward. It doesn't give you the atmosphere of the dirt and the intense activity of a thrashing gang. I suppose you couldn't reproduce that at a demonstration. What you can see is what the machine did. A revolving cylinder knocked the corn against a concave of close bars, separating the grain from the straw and grading it into bags.
So, Johnny, when I first met you, you were a very young man, and you were very strong, and is that right? Do you remember it that way?
I suppose I was. I was doing the heavy work at the end of the machine. I was carrying the sacks. It was 2 1/4 hundredweights for the wheat. And my reaction was, I thought you were very young to be supervising so much, but you got it done. You were up on the engine, and I was the business end, looking after the sacks of corn that came out, which would always be a farmer's man doing that.
Yes, it was a matter of pride that if one man could lift a sack of 2 1/4 hundredweight, you felt you wanted to do the same, and so it was a matter of pride if you could. I used to attempt to do so. I was a rather stripling of a fellow, rather thin, and I found it very hard to do, but I still did it. The dust in the thrashing operation was terrific sometimes, especially at the end of the season. Everything would be dried out, there would be vermin in the ricks, and all sorts of weed seeds would be dried out, and the clouds of dust would go up. And for the driver, he had to sometimes get his head right inside the machine to clear it out. Very dusty, and very unpleasant, really.
What I remember, John, is the atmosphere of thrashing, which is very hard to convey unless you experienced it. First of all, the noise. The booming noise of the machine that you could hear across country, and the number of people. 2 on top of the rick, 2 on top of the machine, 1 younger man carrying the corn, the driver, 4 or 5 old fellows crawling about under the machine, getting the dust and dirt out, because it was the tramps, the followers, who were given those dirty jobs.
We had to have casual labour, some of which you might describe as hobos or tramps. We'd gather them together, and the driver would do his best to keep them in a bunch so that we went from farm to farm with all these people.
They'd creep in anywhere where they could. After I got married in 22, I come to Bovington to work, and I went to feed the old cows in the morning. I'd stick me fork in, you see, to get a pitchfork full of hay. What's it, man? That was a man asleep in there. See, he was asleep in this lot of hay.
Yeah.
Fret me bloody clean to death. You see your fork come back at you, wait with a pitch of hay, and it was old Shuggle Harris, the watchmaker's son. Well, that was his home. It's anybody else's shed.
Tom Reed spent a good deal of his life as an engine driver for John Button, who came to Steam Fair with me. The amount of labour that was involved in those days made me feel they ought to be organised into a union, but nobody was very interested.
Nothing in this area, no farmers' union in this area. You've got to fight it all off your own back.
Also, around here, most farmers were working alongside the men. If you went out to Royston or into Norfolk or something, there were big farms, and there wasn't the same contact between the men and the farmer himself.
No.
I mean, the majority of farmers around here are quite small. Nobody would be working themselves.
I don't know whether you did, but I mean, old Alf Bergen used to come. If we was out in a field of Swedes, he'd be one.
Yes.
In the gang.
Well, I was always working too with Will and George Baxter and the rest of them. And most of the people in this area were working just as hard themselves as the men were. Yeah. And therefore they understood each other a bit better, even although they did take a hard, tough attitude. If they hadn't got enough work, and if it was a bit hard for them too, men did go at very short notice. Yeah.
Of course, his rations was a bit better than ours, would you see, the boss?
It might have been. If it was hard for farm workers, it wasn't much better for farmers or agricultural contractors either. The Boughton family, who'd had 13 threshing sets at the end of the First World War, were down to 2 in the 30s when John joined the business.
Once I'd sort of learnt the rudiments of the business after I left school, my father conceived the notion that I might be able to get some orders and build the business up a bit. So he sent me off. I went to farm after farm and found that the farmer would say, "Well, sorry, we'd like to give you some work. We know your father, we know your family, we'd like to give you some work, but we're growing nothing else but grass, and there's nothing here at all."
Even in the Depression, timber was a thriving business in Chesham itself. The town lived by wood, and trees had to be hauled and cut up. Steam engines could be pressed into service this way when work was not available on the farms.
During the summer months, we had to do what we could. It was a time of, between the wars, it was a time of great innovation and ingenuity. We had to earn our living, we had to do what there was to be done. Sawing wood, hauling trees, doing anything that the steam engine would do.
I know at some stage, John, your family, through developing the timber hauling side of your business, inevitably put out of business an old established activity in Chesham itself, which was horse haulage of timber, whereby they used to go with teams of 3 horses on each wagon. We used to go away perhaps days on end, hauling timber back to Chesham and High Wycombe. But of course they couldn't compete with you. Your method was so much more modern, it put them right out, and at least 4 firms in Chesham ceased trading.
The driver had to get up very early in the morning to get the engine ready for thrashing or for steam ploughing. The flues had to be swept, the clinkers had to be removed from the fire lit, and if we were starting at thrashing at, say, 7 o'clock, the driver would have to be in the field by 5 o'clock, getting ready. The engines used to travel from farm to farm on the road. We used to say that slow speed was 1 mile an hour, fast speed 2 miles an hour. We had to pick up water about every 7 miles. We had to find it where we could, ponds, streams, or anywhere else where we could find water holes or ditches. Some of the drivers used to cook their breakfast in the boiler, in the firebox. They used to take what we call the clinker shovel, which was a shovel with a very long handle, and put the eggs and bacon in there, and put them through the fire hole, and cook them that way. They had a particularly good taste first thing in the morning.
The farmer provided coal and water for the engine. It's easy to be nostalgic about steam-driven machines now, but when they were used for work with a lot of exposed moving parts, they were dangerous. Men lost their legs in the drum and their fingers in the belts.
Went in and went to thread me needle in the string, pulled it through. You see, you put your hand in like that to pull it through. There was a big needle come over. Of course, as he touched the machine, he shut it in gear. So that come through, so he just went straight through my finger. So it all hung in pieces in my hand, you see. So old Stambridge said, what are you going to do about it, mate, Tom? I said, well, I don't know, I said. When we take it off, chop it off, and what are we going to do? So he took me down to the hospital, and as I say, he waited there, and he said, you'll have a straight finger. I said, no, bloody fear I ain't, mate. I'm not having one cock and eight. I said, no, all others bent. I said, chop it off. So, of course, I pulled this skin back, and I think right pair of shears. Off come your finger. Sewed it up. He said, oh, would you like a drink? Well, I said, I should, love a drink. I don't feel too good. He brings a bloody glass of milk out. Jesus, man, I said I couldn't drink that if I felt well. He said, what? I said, no fear. So he just went in and Mrs. Stambridge come out. So she said, well, the poor man wants a drink. So she brought me a drop of whiskey, see. I said, that's better music.
The story of the Boughton's agricultural business, like that of my farm, is the story of farming this century, building up to the First World War and then crashing in the 20s, slowly building up again until the Second World War, which was to revolutionize everything and almost obliterate the traditional pattern of farming.
Now the sun had set beyond yon hill across yon dreary moor, when weary and lame a poor boy came up to this farmer's door. He said, can you tell me where'er there be that I can seek employ for to plough and to sow and reap and mow and be a farmer's boy and to be a farmer's boy? Now in course of time he grew a man and that good old farmer died. He left him the farm and all he had and his daughter for his bride. And he blessed that happy day when he came that way to fonder for employee and to be a farmer's boy. To be a farmer's boy and to be a farmer's boy.
If you'd like to find out more about farming and its recent history, there's a free leaflet produced by the BBC and the English Tourist Board, which accompanies the series. It gives details of where you can visit a farm or country museum in your own area, and can be obtained by sending a large self-addressed envelope, stamped with 22p postage, to 70 Summers, BBC Television, London W12, 8QT.